May I request Mr. Shashi Krishnan to start this panel? I think Mr. Yuva Bhatt is already here. May I request Mr. Nilesh Shah? Is there? Okay. Yeah. I request everyone, please to be seated. Please have your seats.
Good evening, and I think welcome to the last session of the day. I think we had a set of very interesting sessions through the day, and this panel actually needs no introduction. Prabhat runs Nomura in India, Nilesh runs Kotak Asset Management, Saurabh runs Ambit, and Mr. Bhatt runs Dalton. And you would have seen them very often in that big screen that I see downstairs, every other day. So if you count the days of the week, I'm sure you'd see each one of them every day on that. But just to, set the ground rules before we start, in the first session, Dina made a very interesting statement. She says that armchair intellectuals, criticize that no real change has happened on the ground. So I think I just want to warn all you guys that you can't afford to be armchair intellectuals in this session, right? The SEBI chairman actually followed this up by saying that, things are extremely good. In fact, he did say that the overseas investors, and that to Mr. Bhatt, to you, they put in $180 billion, and that's worth something like $350 billion today. So they've had a good ride in the Indian markets to date. And the mutual funds have done extremely well because they've been able to collect 71,000 crores. And therefore, the markets have actually been very helpful and things are going on well. So I think the context has already been set for a lot of what we want to say, I presume. And through the day, I think, 2-3 things came up. Our debt panel, did seem to suggest that they expect interest rates to come down. But I think there was one very interesting observation which, some of us may have to answer, and they seem to suggest that, irrespective of whether interest rates drop or, subsidies come down, and sort of this is especially for you because you've been harping on the subsidy theme, and maybe I'll ask you that, they seem to suggest that the funding gap is so large that the investment cycle will not take off unless we look at, more creative solutions. I think from the infrastructure space, we had people in the last panel, and Prabhat, maybe this will be interesting to you because you recently had a chat with Mr. Gadkari, I presume. They did seem to suggest that the ROEs of many of the power companies would be completely nullified by the cost they're paying for coal. So some good, some bad, and therefore I think that's the context I thought we need to discuss over here. So let me start with Nilesh because it's easier for me to turn on my left. And Nilesh, you invariably use a lot of cricketing analogies, I presume, because many of the seminars I've attended, you tend to use a lot of cricketing analogies. And I think you did seem to suggest that most players in this market got into equity over the last couple of months, expecting it to be a T20. Only to find that they were in the wrong game, because this game was not a T20 game, it was a five-day test match. And that has led to a lot of disappointment, and people need to realign the way they look at how they would invest into this market, especially the equity markets. And maybe I thought I would kick off this discussion with asking you about that, and how should investors realign their expectations?
The investors should not read too much into the headlines. I think today's headlines are not able to capture the mood of country, which I could gather over my last 10 days of Bharat Brahman. On the ground, things are changing, but for some reason, media doesn't want to probably report that. So we met a road contractor, which applied through e-tender in Udaipur without going to Delhi, got the contract and the auction process monitored on his laptop, and within 3 hours get the letter of allotment which he could sign and start work next day. In the previous regime, it took 6 months to do it. But our media will not report that ease of doing business means doing work in 3 days, which otherwise used to take 6 months with payment of facility charges. We met an iron ore miner who is saying that in Odisha now 18 mines will be operational, and that will add 20% to India's iron ore volume. Now, if you're optimistic, you will say that mines are becoming operational and I'll make 45% EBITDA. If you're pessimistic, you will say that, oh shit, these mines are not operational when my EBITDA was 78%, but now I only make 45%. You know the grass is greener, at least you're making 45% EBITDA. In no other industry you can make that kind of EBITDA. We met a railway contractor, and media failed to highlight that we all know in railway, freight is a big component of income, and people collide with railway officials to underpay the freight. The last revival of railway happened when Lalu Yadav and Sudhir Mishra started weighing the loading correctly. Then they had installed electronic weighing scales whose software was manipulated by employees to ensure that the underreporting continued. Now that has been caught. This alone can add so much to the railway's freight income. We met a contractor who said that good days have come back for honest contractor and bad days have come for the dishonest contractor. So be it road, be it railway, be it mining, even in many other sectors which for lack of time I wouldn't go into, things have started changing. But for some reason, this is not being highlighted. It's not that everything has improved. There are many things which we have to do. But on ground, things have started moving. And my feeling is that if you can give time to the government to deliver and hope and pray that oil and monsoon continues to remain favorable to us, then in this test match, your inning, I'm sure it will be very, very rewarding.
Thanks. So I think the context needs to be a test match rather than T20. Mr. Bhatt, I mean, Dalton is known worldwide as a strategic asset allocator. So, I mean, normally, you look at, cycles and strategically reallocate assets depending on how you see cycles moving. Now, do you think there is anything different that's happened in India that, merits overseas investors allocating more money to India than to sort of many of the other countries across the world? Because what is it that, would strategically induce you to look at India more favorably than sort of other markets?
Hello. There are various aspects to this. Foreign investors, when they want to invest in India, there are two fundamental factors they have to look at. One is whether they would invest so much in equities globally. And having taken a decision there, then they have to find out whether India is attractive enough as an investment destination. Now, for the first question, India does not have anything to do with that because it is a global asset allocator's view as to whether he should invest so much in equities or elsewhere. So therefore, having taken the decision, India has to be a good enough market to attract funds. And it has, as of today, as you said, $350 billion, almost a quarter of the market capitalization in this country is in FII hands. And given the fact that there has been a fundamental change in the political economy of this country, it is for the first time that we have a majority right-wing government in place, which is the sort of thing that has revolutionized UK with Margaret Thatcher or US with Ronald Reagan. So something like that is probably happening here. So it will probably take time. It is not going to happen suddenly. But over the next 5 years, given the sort of decisions that have been taken over the last 10 months, I think there is reasonable hope for us that the market will perform very well. But having said that, as I was discussing with a friend, FIIs have been in this market for the last about 22 years. And we as a country, we as a nation, have still not decided how to tax them. Because every day we will have some new sort of pinpricks for FIIs and even domestic investors for that matter. about how they are going to tax, whether there is going to be MAT, whether no MAT, whether they are to be their income is to be taxed as business income or capital gains, long-term capital gains, short-term capital gains. We still don't have clarity on this. Every income tax officer has his view, and so therefore, quite a lot of FIs have found that it is very easy to come into India now, but getting out is impossible. That is, you cannot close business and go. So, I mean, that is the sort of reputation that we have. In fact, that is why we have a unique P-note structure in this country, because this is exactly like, you know, having an RTO agent in an RTO office. So the P-note service provider is basically someone who gives you access, who opens the doors for you and manages the tax regime, manages to deal with the uncertainties of taxation. But I mean, that is actually a very sad commentary on us as a nation, that we need to employ RTO agents to get your license renewed. Similarly, for FIIs, we need to have P-note service providers to be able to invest in India. So that is the state of affairs as far as, you know, how we treat FIIs is concerned. But nevertheless, they have shown immense faith in this country, and that's why they have invested, you know, 1/4 of the market is virtually with them. But the fact is that I think given the change in the political economy, given the accent on doing business in India, make in India, you know, export competitiveness and stuff like that, I think it is reasonable to hope that FIIs would continue to allocate reasonable amounts of money into this country. May not be, you know, $20, $30 billion per annum, but at least about $12 to $15 billion is something that we can reasonably hope.
So I think that's good news for us, because Mr. Bhatt does believe that $15 billion will come into the Indian market. Saurabh, you know, I was reading one of your recent research reports, and you seem to have opined in that recent, you know, report that this government is seeking to engineer a whole set of resets. And you've talked about a shift to the formal financial system. You've talked about moving away from crony capitalism. You've talked about redefining the subsidy regime. Now, what you seem to suggest in that report is, you know, a lot of the traditional constraints that investors had would change, and, you know, the entire nature of the market would change. Now, for an investor sitting out here, obviously that itself could be a very scary proposition, because if the entire nature of the market changes, then what are we supposed to look for next? So I would like your views on that.
So I think given that been very kindly invited by you to speak at the BSE, let me use the Sensex as a way to demonstrate how rapidly India changes when the sort of government that you are mentioned comes in. So I'll use 1991 as an example. If you look at the 91 reforms, they utterly transformed the Sensex. So between 92 to 2002, the Sensex 60%. So of the 30 companies in the Sensex in May 92, 18 were out of the Sensex by May 2002. In the subsequent decade, the churn ratio, I call this the churn ratio, number of companies getting ejected from the Sensex in a 10-year period, that churn ratio dropped off to around 30–40%. And my reckoning is, what's happened in the 9 months since Narendra Modi got elected as PM, he's already set in train a set of changes which will generate huge churn in the Sensex. And I can say with a great deal of conviction that in the next 10 years, half of today's Sensex will not be there in the Sensex 10 years hence. The gentleman who sat in UR's place, Mr. Agarwal from ENY, I think gave you in fair bit of detail what will happen in the metal sector. And I took away the simple inference basis what he's saying, that several of the listed metals and mining companies in the Sensex today will find it really, really hard to stay in the Sensex 10 years hence. So just to list the 3 resets I think the Prime Minister is pushing through, and these are big resets. They're going to be painful for the economy over the next 12 months. I don't think growth will be anywhere near the 8% fantasy figure that's being touted both by the government and by many people in my community. The resets are a fairly savage crackdown on black money. The black money bill that's envisaged as going through Parliament in this session will make having assets abroad, having undeclared assets abroad, a non-bailable criminal offense. That's the first time in our country's history that having undeclared assets abroad will be a non-bailable criminal offense. And my reckoning is the government will enforce this law with a great deal of venom. What my sources suggest is already we are seeing a major freezing up of black money capital for the real estate sector. It bodes well for organized financial services. The gents on my left who come from the asset management and the life insurance sector, I think flows of funds into that sector will increase as black money gets attacked, and that's a point the FM made explicitly in his budget speech. The second reset the PM is seeking to engineer is squeezing subsidies. In the 10 years from 04 to 014, we saw subsidies compounding at 20%. 20% compounding in subsidies over 10 years. Since this government took charge, both in FY15 and in FY16, subsidies are actually being cut. And the budgeted cut in subsidies in the current fiscal is 9%. You'll have to go back 25, 30 years to see a year in which India cuts subsidies by 9%. Now, logically speaking, that will result in a consumption slowdown. It doesn't take that much maths to figure out that if you go from 20% compounding in subsidies to minus 9%, you will see a consumption slowdown, and I think one is underway. But it spells good news, because for a change, we are going to spend within our means. We're going to get that budget deficit under control, and that spells good news for interest rates, as I think the debt panel seems to have opined today. The third reset is a very different equation with the business community. Probably will be very controversial for me to opine at length, but I will invite all of you to read Narendra Modi's interview in the Hindustan Times on 9th of April. That was his first press interview since becoming Prime Minister. Read that interview. I think it gives you a very clear indication that he has not become Prime Minister to help brokers and bankers make money. And neither has he become Prime Minister to help a certain type of capitalist make money. He's been elected by the people, and he wants to, I'm sure, get re-elected by even greater number of people. And as a result, his priorities are not quite the priorities that perhaps many in our community expected them to be. It's a very, very unusual interview for a head of state to make, and the point I'm trying to make is his equation with the business community will be very different to what the equation the previous government had, and it's not necessarily an equation where he'll dole out largesse. Again, citing the E&Y partner, Mr. Agarwal, he's not making life easy for the power generation or for the metals and mining sector, and what it means is Indian promoters will have to get used to a Prime Minister who will ask them to deliver services at a very reasonable rate of return, and if they refuse to do so, he will say, well, thank you very much, I've got both foreign investors, FDI investors, and public sector entities who are willing to step into your shoes. So big changes are underway. They're not going to be painless for the economy. The year we are in will be a fairly painful year for the economy, but ahead of us lies the benefits of structural reform, and it means, I think, fairly rapid churn in the Sensex over the next 10 years. This is 1991 all over again. It's just that it's being done in a fairly quiet manner.
Thanks, Saurabh. So what I take away from that is 50% of the index going to change possibly in the next couple of years. So
10 years.
10 years, okay. 10 years, right? He's buying time. But I think what the difference it makes to all of us as investors is that we'll have to search for those new market leaders. And I think that's going to be the big opportunity, as well as a very, very difficult thing for most of us. Prabhat, a question to you. I mean, whenever I've heard you, in your public comments, you've always said that India will outperform most global markets. And, you seem to think that overseas investors, including the Japanese, will look at India with a very different prism as they look at other markets. And this is in spite of the fact that many Japanese who have come directly into India haven't really, been able to make things work. I mean, even if you take, for example, the freight corridor or some of the pharma deals that you've seen, they do seem to have problems in India. So why is it that you think that overseas investors will look at India, with a very different prism as compared to other emerging markets?
Okay, I think there are 2 or 3 large structural points which essentially sort of mean that India probably will be a better destination. I mean, first of all, the investment or the returns on investments come through an opportunity. An opportunity essentially arises from, what I call shortage, or, I mean, one reason why you see higher interest rates in India is if you had Singapore interest rates in India, you can only imagine how many Maruti cars you'll be selling and how many, sort of bags of cement will require to fund houses. The fact is that India remains, a supply-side constrained economy. You basically, and typically in a supply-side constrained economy, if you are able to fund or if you create a decent set of investment projects, then you can get growth. Our problem or failure as a country has been that despite having a very high savings rate, our household saves a lot, we have not been able to channelize that household savings into productive assets. We have thrown it into subsidy, for example, last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years of UPA government, or we have essentially put into assets which have ultimately turned unproductive. For example, you put power plants, but you are not able to supply coal, so you are not able to get a holistic sort of picture behind, or the government behind getting these investments into place and being profitable. So once you change that paradigm and really think about, putting into place a very transparent regime which tells you how you'll make money, I think eventually the capital will start finding its way back to investments. And that, when the investment to GDP ratio tends to rise, then structural growth in a country rises, which is what happened in the last cycle. All the reforms that happened in 2002 essentially were to open up a lot of sectors to private investment, which essentially meant that, telecom sector or power sector, which were totally supply starved, essentially private money came in a big way, and you had a structural growth pickup. It is a matter of, obviously, it's another matter that we mugged it up quite royally. And I think that is what we are going through. We're going through a cleaning process. Not only of the cleaning up of the past mistakes, but also cleaning up of the systems that eventually lead to these kind of mistakes being made. Once that happens, I think the long-term growth path in Indian economy will be much higher. As I said, the lower interest rates in the rest of the world are telling you what? If you don't borrow at 0% interest rates, what opportunity do you have? I'm telling you, if you give 0% interest to Indian entrepreneurs, I think you can only imagine what kind of boom will follow. So the fact is that I think after a while, once these policy effects have taken place, the structural growth rate of India will rise compared to the world which is overbuilt, which has already had a debt-fueled rally, overbuilt roads, overbuilt whatever, what has happened in China, you can see. And that is what gives you outperformance over the long-term, sustained basis. Your growth rates will rise, your earnings will rise, and you'll continue to compound at a faster pace. That's what I think will happen.
Nilesh, you must excuse me for this question. But, I was reading one of your commentaries in the mutual fund for when the third quarter earnings came out. And you did mention that the third quarter earnings were disappointing. And you did seem to suggest that it was one-off. Now we are in the fourth quarter. And fourth quarter earnings are equally disappointing. Now, obviously, many of us will explain it as one more off, or whatever, however you explain it. But, obviously, markets are disappointed. And I think a large part of this correction that you're seeing is because of this. But where do you think, this will turn around, and what will be the key sort of triggers to turn around earnings in the next, if at all they turn around in the next couple of quarters?
Sashi, I completely agree that the fourth quarter numbers have not come up to the expectations. But if you see Maruti result, it kind of shows the glimmer which future can hold. If you see Reliance Industries numbers, the turnover came down from 1 lakh crore to 76,000 crore, and profit went up from 5,000 crore to 6,000 crore. So somewhere both Reliance and Maruti are indicating what the future will hold. Where did we go wrong in estimating fourth quarter numbers? One, we could never imagine that rupee will appreciate against euro, yen, GBP so much. From October, somewhere around mid-October to mid-November, all those currencies just took off by 15-20%. And then there was a sharp impact onto the exports, especially into Europe, Britain, and Japan. The way I see today, entrepreneur is suffering from a couple of things. One, the average capacity utilization for country has come down. We were running at 77% utilization. Today we are at 68% utilization. Lower utilization means lower margin. Second, the RBI has kept money supply growth at about 2003 level of 12%. So if I'm feeding country half meal, obviously they will look like tired and starved. In 2008, our M3 growth was probably 20% plus. Today we are at 12%. Obviously working capital cycle gets stretched, interest rate remains high. There is not enough liquidity available for people to do business. The third was the commodity price correction, be it copper, steel, aluminum, plastic, PVC, everything is down 25 to 30%. And today, it is reflected through inventory losses into quarterly numbers rather than being reflected into better margin through lower raw material cost. Now, on top of it, you had projects which were conceived as an integrated manufacturer, like Vedanta Aluminium, but it became a converter because he's not getting raw material from, whosoever was supposed to supply it. So put all these things together, the fourth quarter numbers have come down, and partly also because exports falling through the cliff because of the appreciation of these currencies. But let's jump to FY17. Would the capacity utilization have inched up by then meaningfully? The answer is yes, because no new capacities are added, so the old capacities will be operated at a better level. Your 12% money supply growth would have become 14 or 16%. The answer is yes. You don't want to starve the nation of credit forever. And by trimming inflation, we have become fitter. So now we are entitled to eating 2 days for meals twice a day rather than just once a day. So more money in economy will create its own, impetus on growth. Third, all this commodity price falls will be behind us, and that will be now reflected as lower raw material cost into better margin. Interest cost would have come down. A 1% reduction in interest rate is 7% earnings growth. So better utilization, lower interest rates, better credit growth, commodity prices softening down. All these things will result into FY17 earnings growth probably jumping up beyond 20-25%. And that is what is worth playing for.
So you're saying we need to wait for 4 more quarters before we see things changing for the better. So on the same lines, Mr. Bhatt, I just wanted to ask you, you did mention, MAT being one of those big sentiment busters. So for global asset allocators, as much as there are local issues like MAT or possibly even this Mauritius Treaty, which keeps coming up for discussion every 3 months and then somebody discusses it, right? You also have a lot of global factors that sort of would determine whether your global asset allocation to equity and hence to India, is really going to increase or not increase. For example, it could be, whatever, something happening in Yemen, or it could be the European crisis, or it could be the Fed rate hike. How do you see the situation, say, in the next 3-4 quarters in terms of a lot of both these global sentiment busters and domestic sentiment busters?
Well, I think there are a few issues like what you said, the most pressing issue being the situation in Greece. If we can sort out these problems, it looks like as if Greece is finally not going to exit from the EU, but to continue with probably a slightly diminished role, but they would continue. As long as that problem is solved, I think one big uncertainty, at least in Europe, is solved. And that, because finally we have to realize that however large and however attractive India be as a market, but finally international investors look at India or look at any emerging market for that matter as a high-risk asset. They are very comfortable investing in the developed markets if they can get even probably half the return that we get here. So therefore, they're demanding a much higher return from investments into risky markets like us. So therefore, the fact is that as long as there are huge uncertainties in the globe, the likelihood of countries like us attracting big money is much less. So therefore, for us to really attract a lot of foreign institutional investments, we need to have a stable world so that people are prepared to take risks. So today we have sources of high risk in the international context, Greece or Yemen, ISIS, Ukraine, maybe even the US interest rate hike. But I think international investors take a view on this. How is this going to pan out? Today, it looks like as if with some problems, maybe for the next few weeks, Greece might be solved, at least for the present. It might not be a very long-term solution, but for the present, they'll be probably able to pay their bills. Then probably put the clock back about 2-3 weeks ago, I think Yemen was a very big problem. But today, I don't think people really worry too much about Yemen, or about Ukraine for that matter, even though there are always some small pinpricks here and there. But in the US, as of now, I think there's a Fed meeting going on which they decide, in the statement coming out of that, we will probably realize what is their view. But most people seem to suggest that even if there is a hike in US interest rates of maybe 25 basis points, I mean, most bets were that it will happen sometime in June, but I think now it is sort of extended a bit, probably by the end of the year. But even if that were to happen, it doesn't look like as if it is a part of a series of hikes. It will be probably one hike just to show the intent, but the next hike may be quite some time away. So, and this is one of those events for which there is probably something like about 18 months notice. And if you can't readjust your portfolios for an event that is likely to happen 18 months hence, something is wrong with us. So to that extent, I think the market will absorb this reasonably well. So the sum and substance is that most of the risks that we can, as of now, foresee internationally are probably under some sort of control. So therefore, there is a very good likelihood of money being allocated to equities and to emerging markets. And if India does well, over the next few quarters, I think there is a lot of opportunity for money to flow into India.
Yeah, so a couple of things I heard. One is that global risks are there, but seem to be under control. And if India does better than other people in terms of, reducing these risks for global investors, definitely they'll put in more money into India. Saurabh, I just wanted to get back on, again, some of the fundamental research which you have done, where you've talked about, coffee can portfolios, you've talked about 10-bagger portfolios. I mean, pretty complicated stuff, I presume. But what I do understand from, from whatever limited understanding I have is that you're looking at clean managements, but more importantly, you're looking at efficient capital allocation. And I think that's the crux of a lot of the arguments that you're making, that, if it's efficient capital allocation, those companies will do well. Now, I don't know, from my own experience, I tend to find that people who do efficient capital allocation for the long term are often punished by the markets in the short term. Because what happens is you've got a lot of short-term pain because you're allocating capital for long term. And in the short term, you obviously, don't make the kind of profits that people think you should be making because of that capital allocation. And therefore, markets tend to punish them. Do you see that as an opportunity to get in? And how patient should investors be? And how do you actually distinguish that this is actually efficient capital allocation or something else?
Right. So I think what we have tried to do in our stock-specific strategy research is see companies through a very simple prism, which is, if a company can generate ROC and revenue growth. So let's take revenue growth as a metric of scale and ROC as a metric of the strength of the franchise. Think of it like this: ROC protects the franchise, return on capital employed, that is, protects the franchise, and revenue growth grows the franchise. If you were to look at these two metrics, it helps you narrow down the market very, very easily and quite dramatically. So just to give you an example, if you take the last 10 years in India, 10 years where our GDP growth has been higher than it's ever been before, and if you look for companies which have posted return on capital employed of, say, 15% or more every year for the last 10 years, not a particularly high amount, by the way, 15% or more return on capital employed every year for the last 10 years. There's actually no more than 50 or 60 companies in India which have had 15% or more ROCE each year for the last 10 years. Then add a simple metric of, I want not just ROC greater than 15, I also want revenue growth greater than 10%. Our nominal GDP growth is around 11-12%, so you would assume 10% revenue growth is not particularly demanding. What you find is quite remarkable. You find there's no more than a dozen or so companies in our country, no more than a dozen or so companies in the entire Indian market, which have had 10 years of ROC greater than 15% consecutively, and 10 years of revenue growth greater than 10%. Now, the beautiful thing is this: if you were to look at these companies, on average, they beat the Sensex every year by something like 17 to 18% per annum. And I can do this exercise going back to 95. I can go back as far in time. But what I've found is, if you were to buy these portfolios and hold them for 10 years, you beat the market by anywhere between 15 to 20%, right? And you're doing something very simple. You're looking back at the last 10 years. Looking back at the last 10 years, you're looking for companies which are consistent ROC generators and have reasonable revenue growth. And you're buying them, and then you're sitting on them for 10 years. And you're finding a remarkable result that you're beating the market by 15% over a 10-year period, and you're doing so pretty consistently. It's not as if, I'm saying it only happens once in a blue moon. And that just gives you a sense of how rare it is to find companies in India which allocate capital rationally, efficiently over long periods of time. And what I think this year gives us a wonderful opportunities because of the dislocation that's happening, because of the reforms that this government is initiating, the pain that it's causing in, say, this set of results. We've had remarkable numbers. For example, Ultratech, in effect, Ultratech cement volumes are down 9% YOY. I can't remember too many times where India's largest cement company has 9% drop in volume growth. We've had, not dissimilar results from ACC. We've had 3 or 4 large high-quality private sector banks reporting big jumps in asset quality deterioration. So I think we'll have bad results this set of results. We'll have bad results in July, August. We'll, I think, have bad results going right up to Diwali. What it'll do is it'll make very high-quality companies, several high-quality companies, come down 15, 20, 30, 40%. And it'll open up a wonderful time for stock picking, because I think it's very difficult to see how the reforms that are being triggered off at the moment will be anything other than good for the country. I think Prabhat rightly said we are a supply-constrained country. We are supply-constrained in capital. Our cost of capital is the highest outside sub-Saharan Africa. We are supply-constrained in skilled labor. Skilled labor is very difficult to get. Buying land is very difficult for industrial use. So if this government is attacking those supply-side constraints, which I think it is, and you will get the benefits of that flowing through, say, 10 months, 11 months, 12 months hence, the next 6 to 9 months are great time for buying high-quality names. And again, you can use very simple metrics to simplify the exercise, or you can turn to the organized asset management industry and entrust them with your money. But the point is, next 6 to 9 months is a wonderful time to pick high-quality names. It will feel very scary because the growth numbers will get rammed pretty hard. Earnings will look awful for the next 6 to 9 months, but it'll be a great time to buy high-quality names.
Yeah, so I think the message I get from you, Saurabh, is that if you could look at people who are good at capital allocation over the long term, irrespective of the short-term pain, you should stay invested in them. And opportunities like that, arise very rarely in markets, and this could be one of those opportunities. Prabhat, you've very often talked about the macro versus the micro, I presume. And the macro obviously is positively biased, and all the views that we've had over here seem to suggest that the macros are positively biased. We do tend to get a sense from both Nilesh and Saurabh that, you could have pain on the micros. And anecdotally, like he said, cement, you've had problems on the cement side. You could have problems possibly on some of the two-wheeler to four-wheeler side. So on the ground, I think still things look a little hazy. And do you think, a lot of these micros will change over the next couple of quarters?
When we talk about macro, there are two parts of macro. The other first part is about the macro environment, which relates to current account deficit, fiscal deficit, inflation, interest rates. That's one part of the economy, which is basically fodder for capital formation. And that part of the economy was very distressed for a very long time, especially because we had current account deficit reaching 5%. We had inflation running into 10% per annum for a long time. This part of macro actually in the long term inhibits growth primarily because you essentially choke off the economy by doing. So now adjustment of this sort, basically when you say that I'm adjusting, this macro essentially means that you have to bring down demand. Because if you have high inflation, you have basically a supply-demand mismatch. How do you bring down inflation? By cutting subsidies, by raising prices. In the short term, it'll cause more pain, it will cause a growth slowdown because you're essentially taking away from the economy. And that process, I think, well, actually, to be fair, Mr. Chidambaram started this process by raising oil prices in the first place. And I think we've gone through that pain. So that part of equation has largely corrected, which is one of the reasons why Indian currency actually was so resilient in this whole taper, in the last taper episode, because you essentially are, well, there's oil prices also, but before that also Indian current account had already corrected. Now, second part is about growth. Now, growth, so you might have a lot of money. We have a current account surplus today after oil prices have fallen. So essentially, current account surplus denotes that you have excess of money. You really can't invest that money. You got capital flowing out. What do you do with this money? Are we able to invest that money? That is a different sort of equation. I mean, I can give an analogy of, let's say, Hindustan Unilever, which which has a lot of capital coming out, but dividends out everything because in its business it doesn't need much. Now, it could be one of that reason, or it could be a reason that you're scared to invest your money. Now, India's case, the case is that even though there's an opportunity, people are not able to invest that money. That's the second part of macro, which is not yet fixed, or which is in the process of getting fixed. As that gets fixed, you essentially marry the capital availability to the capital usage, and that raises growth rates. So I think we are very much in middle of that course correction that has happened. So, you know, our investment cycle, you know, banks sanctioned 4 lakh crores of loans in 2010. Last year, in FY14, they did 1 lakh 34. You can imagine sort of fall from that top, and that will have a large long-term base impact. So that I think if we run through. I personally think that growth will start looking stronger in about 6 months' time, primarily because we've run through all these negatives. And as that growth picks up, the sustainability of that will be much higher because you have taken out these hygiene factors already. So I'm quite bullish actually in terms of when the growth picks up, it will be very durable and it will continue for a long time.
So yeah, just picking up from that banking sector, Nilesh, you seem to have been reasonably bullish on banks. I think most of us institutional investors, you know, have by force been bullish on banks because it's 25%, 30% of the index, or by choice we've been bullish on banks. I think you've been overweight private banks, underweight public banks, but on the whole, you've been very bullish on banks. But if you look at the last couple of quarters, you know, it does seem as if, you know, a lot of the banks seem to be going back into, you know, some of the cycle that we feared would continue. Like, you know, we did think there was improvement, but, you know, it does seem to be coming in a little late. So, if you look at returns, for example, I think the banking index has fallen something like 13.5%, 14%. The Sensex may have fallen by something like 8%. So obviously the index has fallen significantly more and the banking sector is taking a beating. So would you still, you know, hold this as one of those sectors which you think is fundamentally going to, you know, be the market leader in the next couple of quarters?
I think for some time to come, we will see banking and financial services sector to be torchbearer for the market. One, at 12% M3 growth, our deposit growth and credit growth are also anchored around that. At some point of time in 2-3 years, the credit growth will be 14 to 18%, deposit growth will be 14 to 18% because M3 growth would have moved from 12% to 14 to 16%. So you have better deposit and credit growth ahead than the past. Second, as Indians, we have been saving into real estate and gold. Now we are increasingly shifting towards equities and mutual funds and insurance companies and bank deposits and so on and so forth. So there is a rising tide of more financial savings in the country. Last year, about 37 lakh Indians enrolled into SIP in mutual funds. The total number of SIP now is about 78 lakhs. So at least in this population of 1.25 billion, there are 78 lakh smart individuals who want to make money and who are investing wisely. I just hope and pray that they continue investing. They should not stop because markets have corrected. So this increased financial savings along with better growth will create momentum on the deposit side of the balance sheet or the liability side of the balance sheet. On the asset side, yes, the past sins yet have to be paid for, but my guess is that a lot of that is reflected into the prices, and which is why they are all going, many of them are going below book. Going forward, it seems they have learned from their past experience, and hopefully they will lend money to people who are going to pay it back. So the past mistakes will not be repeated in future. That gives us assurance on the asset side. Put all these things together, along with the overall picture. I mean, we knew Air India was 100% monopoly airline company in the country. Over a period of time, private sector came, Indigo, Go, Jet, and Air India got marginalized. MTNL, BSNL were the only telecom companies in India. And they had the luxury of, you know, charging you, they had the luxury of making you wait for a telephone connection for 20 years and 25 years. From that, today who cares about whether MTNL is there or not? So by virtue of the structure of public sector, not because of their people, but by virtue of that structure, they'll all get marginalized. And their place will be taken by the private sector. So I have no doubt in my mind that today when I see banking sector, 25% SBI, 25% private sector, 50% PSU. There will be a time when 50% will be private sector, 25% will be SBI, and 25% will be PSU. And eventually a day will come where 75% will be private sector and 25% will be PSU and SBI. Now just imagine the opportunity which is available to private sector banks and NBFC. Why did what happened to MTNL, BSNL, and Air India will not happen to PSU banks, leaving room for the private sector banks? You go and check with PSU bank managers, how many of them are putting their own son and daughter into their own bank's employment? Very few. I haven't met yet anyone. Ask them where their son and daughter are opening their bank accounts. They also want to open in private sector banks. So public sector banks will have no capital available or limited capital available, limited talent available, limited product available, limited decision making. I mean, with best quality people, they won't be able to turn it around, which will leave room open for private sector banks and NBFCs, and they will create wonders.
So, Nilesh, you think 75% private sector banks, 25% PSU, I mean SBI, and therefore the nature of the banking index will change. And possibly we won't have this kind of a drop because some of the private sector banks haven't fallen as much, right?
So I just want to say one thing. I mean, yesterday ET carried an article about how 1 lakh rupee invested with Kotak Mahindra Finance Limited, which eventually became 1100 crore. Now, obviously, 1 lakh to 1100 crore journey is probably not going to get repeated, but we don't really want that kind of journey, right?
Right. Saurabh, as opposed to Nilesh's view, I mean, obviously you have your coffee can portfolio and you have your 10-bagger portfolio. But if I look at those portfolios, I think your bias is primarily towards defensives. So it's got larger IT, it's got larger pharma, and you actually seem to have a bias against cyclicals. So given this big valuation difference between, pharma and IT, today you get pharma at, 31 times 1 year forward, that's FMCG valuations, right? Why would you, have this kind of a bias, significantly in favor of IT and pharma and significantly against cyclicals?
Yeah. So in our good and clean portfolio, that's the quarterly strategy portfolio product. You are right. We've pared cyclicals back. I think the month before the election, cyclicals were 100% of our model portfolio. Just after the election victory, we cut cyclicals to 90. Somewhere around July last year, we cut cyclicals to 80%. And once Dr. Rajan had begun the rate cutting cycle, we cut cyclicals even further back to 70%. And the reason we did that was our sense was that greater and greater levels of euphoria were getting baked into cyclical stock prices. So, whether I take some of the private sector banks whose price to book went up to, I think some of them touched 5 times book value, or I take, say, our only large industrial stock, L&T, which reached 1900 rupees. My reading was people were getting too excited too early in the cycle. And again, I'll just go back to my little model. We're going through a reform process, a structural reform process. There's a new prime minister running the country. He's quite explicitly telling everybody that under my rule, things will change. We will do things in a different way. As we adjust to Narendra Modi's construct for running the economy, a very different subsidy regime, a very different way of dealing with the promoter community. As we adjust to that, there is bound to be pain in the economy. And I don't think too many investors baked in the pain. They all presume that we'll go from the UPA's rule of 10 years to the NDA rule without any interim adjustment period. And my reckoning is the current year, the FY16 is that interim adjustment period. And in this year, my reckoning is cyclicals will get hit as earnings growth, GDP growth comes under pressure, at least for the next 2 sets of earnings. As I've said before, I don't doubt that the reforms that are being initiated will bear fruit in due course of time, but my reckoning is that's at least 6 months away. And in that period, I think cyclicals have a long way to pull back. I'll just take one sector, cement. Every single cement stock, even now, trades at record EV per ton and EV EBITDA. Last I knew, the business model of the cement sector hadn't changed, and hence, left me wondering as to why should every single cement stock in India trade at record valuations. And that immediately suggests an overvaluation, over-optimism, over-enthusiasm. And a correction was due there. Correction, thankfully, is underway. We have an efficient market. That correction, I think, will carry on for a couple of sets of results. And then I think my sense is our model portfolio will reorient, will load up on cyclicals and get ready for the recovery. I'll shoot off at this stage, Shashi. Very kind of you to invite me and very kind of BSE and IMC to invite me. Thank you, folks. Thanks.
So leaves to leave us for this thing. Prabhat, just to continue with that, you recently had a sort of Bloomberg teleconference with Mr. Nitin Gadkari. So did you come out, a lot more confident about cyclicals, possibly the road sector, possibly the infrastructure sector?
Just on that interview, maybe not, because I think it's his job to be bullish, and he's doing the reforms, and he obviously is all the right intention. But I think that being bullish on the prospect of the sector over the long term, yes. But I think there are issues like, for example, land acquisition. It's not going to be an easy task to get to where they want to get to, but they have to have the right intention. So I think, in general. Talking to Mr. Gadkari was clearly refreshing. There is a minister who thinks very positively in the right construct. But my suspicion is that implementing that will probably take more time. So I think we have to be very clear as investors as to what the delivery will be over the short term or the long term. There are parts of equation which will start firing first, and there will be large parts which will take longer time to be delivered. But I have no doubt that the road program will start picking up, because there have been, even the ministry, I think the decision-making process in the road ministry has changed dramatically. And they don't need to run to MOF or cabinet, for example, cabinet for every decision that they're taking beyond certain amount of road building. So the decision-making actually has devolved a lot on the ministry. And that essentially means that, and that's contrary to what people say, that there's one man running the government. Actually, if you go and talk to the ministry, they'll tell you that they have been told not to come to cabinet every time for projects of certain size, which is why the amount of roads that have been auctioned or given out for concessions this year is much larger than last year. But it has a 6-month gestation. So I think the real pickup, will probably start getting manifest in these sectors. In about 3 to 6 months' time. Now, what will happen is that in this construct, the people who will win will be people who do business honestly. Because end of the day, a certain way of finagling the capital or certain way of figuring out how you can win contracts is no longer, as we have seen in case of many sectors. It's become more transparent, the process. So cleaner balance sheets will win out here, because they're not in distress, they can actually go ahead and acquire more assets. Clearly, I think if you were bidding on a 4 or 5 year process, then there'll be some very large players in the infra space which will emerge, which will be consolidated, running well, and with decent balance sheets. They would have also acquired assets in the meantime. So I think there will be an opportunity here.
So the challenge will be to actually find those clean balance sheets in the infra space today.
Well, I think infra space, you basically look out where the debt equities are lower, they're making EBITDA, decent EBITDA. So that, I think you lower the list considerably. So it'll not be a very big list if you were to do that.
Mr. Bhatt, we've seen this sudden spurt of IPO. So okay, if you go through this panel, we've got banking, we've got cyclicals, we've got FMCG, but we're also seeing a big spurt in IPOs, and you're also going to see a big spurt in, government disinvestment. And I think both the IPO issuances and the government disinvestment is just not going to succeed if the overseas investors don't put in money. I don't think the domestic investors are going to put everything they have into IPOs at this stage. They're going to watch it very carefully. What do you think, would be the view that overseas investors would have? Obviously, they would have a stock-specific view and stuff like that. But with so much money hitting the market, so much of new capital raising hitting the market, you think it will sort of impact sentiment in the medium term?
Given the level of money raising that will be there, both through IPOs or FPOs, plus also government divestment, it's a fair assumption to make that most of the money that would possibly come through foreign investments would be absorbed by this. Because that's the sort of broad brush numbers that we have. IPOs plus divestments would be probably more or less equivalent to the $12–15 billion that I talked about as money that we could expect from...
So that's 15 billion, over the 15 billion they would put into the secondary market?
No. They will probably put 12–15 billion. That could be absorbed by all these new issuances, which means that it's a good thing, because otherwise, for this to be absorbed, somebody will have to sell in the secondary market, someone will have to buy, and the buyer will certainly buy at much lower prices. So it would have impacted the market dramatically. Because this $12–15 billion is coming, probably this money would be absorbed by these IPOs and publicity divestments, and so therefore the market might not fall too much. But if there was this money not coming, then I think the impact on the market would have been dramatic. And of course, it would probably not have been possible also to carry through these IPOs and publicity divestments. But not all publicity divestments are things that most institutional investors like. So that's why you always find quite a few of these which are done at inappropriate prices and inappropriate times end up with who. So therefore, I think as long as they're correctly priced, reasonably priced, as long as the timing is right, and as long as we do the right things in terms of legislation, in terms of taxation, I think it should be possible for the sort of divestment target that the government has to be reached. Plus also, if you have seen, the quality of IPOs have improved dramatically over the last few years. All those fly-by-night guys are a thing of the past. So, and quite often you find the biggest issuances are rights issues these days, not so much by way of IPOs. So I think good companies which have good projects, which have probably had some excesses on account of investments which are not paid off in time, so resulting in skewed leverage ratios, they are the ones who come into the market and raising money, and investors probably are happy giving them that money. So I think the sum and substance is that I think these divestments and IPOs can go through the market as long as the environment is made conducive by the government.
So did I hear you say that private sector IPOs are reasonably priced, but the government divestment seems to be overpriced?
Well, private sector IPOs, the market is the one that is going to price it. So therefore, they have to be reasonably priced, otherwise they don't get subscribed. Whereas in the case of PSU divestments, you and I need not invest. There's always someone else who can be, so who's just a phone call away.
That's a subtle message which I got from that entire conversation. Nilesh, coming back to you, I happened to be watching one of those recent interviews you gave on ET, and you referred very often to your grandmother. So, and you did say that, my grandmother is wiser than all these investors sitting out here, which I presume all our grandmothers were wiser. But you did seem to suggest that if people have got a risk appetite, they should put 100% of their money in equity. I mean, don't look left, don't look right, don't look at any other asset, put all your money into equity. You still hold by that sort of recommendation of your grandmother's?
Yes. So when I referred to my grandma, I referred to my grandmother's generation, and I genuinely found them to be far more intelligent than our generation. See, apart from what you are mentioned, there are a couple of interesting things happening. The Ministry of Finance approved investment by Provident Fund in equity a couple of years back, but Ministry of Labor had not ratified it. Now, there is a decision taken by Ministry of Labor that 5 to 15% of Provident Fund money needs to be invested in equities. Today it will come in index funds, tomorrow I'm sure it will come in other equities as well. The EPFO manages about 6 lakh crore of corpus, and the private players, including public sector companies, Provident Fund, manages roughly about another 6 lakh crore. So if we are lucky, at today's level of 12 lakh crore of provident fund money, 15% is 1,80,000 crore. That kind of money can come into the equity market. Now, none of them are going to come tomorrow. We know for sure. But can I assume that over next 5 years, we go from 0 to 15% in pension fund market? That's roughly 1,80,000 crore at today's value entering equity market over 5 years. That's reasonably large sum of money. 78 lakh Indians are doing SIP. That's going to bring 25,000 crore plus in equity mutual funds. So between the retail investors SIP and provident fund money, we are going to see substantial flows into equity market. And if they will remain focused towards quality stocks, large cap stocks, blue chip stocks, as the first wave of money normally should be, you're actually going to see fair amount of bullishness in our market purely from a flow point of view. And obviously we all talked about how fundamentally things are improving. Now you have a choice. Do you want to follow the wave or do you want to be riding the wave? My recommendation will be to ride the wave, take the risk. Over next 6-8 months, you will get an opportunity to enter into equity market at a reasonable price. And from here onwards, definitely equity looks like outperforming other asset classes. Today, if you buy gold and you sell in Dubai, you straightway lose 10%. If you buy at 2 gram, 3 gram, 5 gram, 10 gram lot, and then try to sell, you lose between 15 to 20%. So choice is up to you whether you want to buy gold or not. In bank fixed deposits, very rarely you will get real rate of return. Today, obviously, you are getting real rate of return, but that's probably for a year or so. Beyond that, equities will outperform. Fixed deposit, fixed income funds, I mean, yeah, 1 year probably they'll outperform, they'll deliver as much return as equity funds. But the second year onwards, equity will deliver 3-4 times return than those fixed income funds. So you have 2-year plus horizon, you have ability to bear 15-20% correction, and you can keep on averaging into a falling market without losing your sleep. Then this is time to put money into equity, 100% money into equity.
So that was a very categorical recommendation. Mr. Bhatt, I want to come to you because unlike Nilesh, I think you seem to believe that it is not worth investing all your money into equity at this point of time. There will be better times for you to invest your money in equity. So why do you believe that, and why do you think you shouldn't put all your eggs in the equity basket at this point of time?
Well, it depends the type of investor you are. If you are you just entered the job market, you got your first job, or first 5 years after you started work, probably that is not the best thing to do, investing everything in equities. You have to, finally you have to secure yourself, your family. So you will need to build some corpus before you really start in a big way. So if you really see, first port of call for any first-time earner is generally, he wants to have a house first. So therefore, he has to save for that, at least for the margin money. I mean, he cannot really save and buy a house in this country. So you have to at least have that 5 or 10% so that you can go to a housing finance company and be eligible for a loan. So that is the first port of call. But once you have sort of set yourself with a certain amount of money for your taking care of emergencies and have taken probably a housing loan and managed the EMIs, that is when probably this should happen in the first probably 5 years of your working life. Thereafter, I think you should invest a larger portion of the money in equities. While equities are very enchanting, but you should have the ability to withstand 20-30% loss. So that comes with having provided for the basic necessities. So that is what we have seen. Even in case, if you have noticed, the savings were highest just in 2007, 2008 in this country. 2007, because everybody was very bullish and everything was going fine till the 2008 meltdown. And after that, it has come down because people, once they're scared that things can go very bad, so that is the time they really want to secure themselves by probably saving a bit more in fixed deposits or fixed income or gold. That is what happened after 2008. So therefore, as a thumb rule, I think unless you have some basic necessities taken care of. You should not really venture into, because if the timing is wrong, then you will probably never return to the equity market. I mean, this is what has happened. After 2008, you have found that quite a lot of people have lost their shirt, and it really, unless the index comes back to that level, people don't come back. Once the index comes back to that level, whatever they were holding, the losing stocks, they first sell. And after that, they watch the index going up another 20% and then they enter again. So therefore, I think it's much better, as was suggested, at least the first-time investors or those who have, the first 5 years of their working life or something, I think they should go through the sort of recurring deposit or the systematic investment plan. That is the best route. But when you have much more money, and if you're full-time into the market, then maybe you can think in terms of better timing. But otherwise, I think it should be systematic investing all the way for most investors.
Yeah. So what you're trying to say, I suspect, is that if your stomach can't take the churn, then stay out of it.
Yes.
Prabhat, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you also wear another hat, right? You are a venture capital investor also. You do put money occasionally into venture capital. Is that right?
Small investment that I put.
Okay. But my question is more in terms of, you looked at that space, and today what happens is there are a lot of such investments that will come to the market. Possibly Flipkart will list tomorrow, or we already have a lot of people who are already there in the market. For example, Myntra would list tomorrow. Now, how should investors look at it? Because many of us don't understand the business model, because all it does is sort of burn capital possibly. We don't know what we are paying for. I'm sure when they list, they will be at a couple of $1 billion valuations. So you've been there, you've put your money out there. How should investors look at it? Because that's going to be an interesting space, I presume, in the next couple of years. You'll have more of these people coming to market.
So I think what I'll take up from what Yuvar was saying, it's essentially all sorts of investment have a risk profile. Your debt investment, for example, are safer than equities, which is why the asking rate of return in equities is higher. You need discount equities, you discount at 13%. And discount debt, obviously discounted the rate that you are getting. So when you're looking at investment, this is much riskier. It has to be in the context of what your overall portfolio looks like. And it has to be small percentage. It is like in asset management, for example, you leave aside 5% for example, if you're managing an index fund, you take 5% out and you put in as returns which you think can do extremely well, but it can be riskier. So I think, sort of looking at individual investors, it has to be an allocation policy as to how much you'll invest. Having said that, I think what happens is that, in any sort of field, like, we have seen the dot-com boom earlier in 2000, there will be a few winners which will come out. And typically what happens is early movers tend to sort of win out here. And what we are seeing essentially right now is everybody's getting funding. Right. And typically I think you'll probably have 3-4 large guys in every vertical who will survive. So you have to be either an early investor or you have to be safe. Trying to be a late investor and trying to do a startup in a space which is already crowded, I think is a very dangerous strategy.
So even when many of these guys come to market, you would advise that, a retail investor shouldn't look at putting money into that. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if it's a market leader, then obviously you can have a look at it. Whether there'll be a judgment, I'm not sure how many people have a good judgment about the valuations here, because at the end of the day, there is no stable business model which is proven. So the fact is these guys don't make money. You don't know how long can they keep burning money or how long they'll keep burning money. So for retail investors, obviously it's far more dangerous in terms of ability to understand. I'm not sure how many people actually, even the investors who are professionally investing in this space, they're probably doing through a portfolio approach. So they're not investing in one company, investing in multiples of these companies. And they can therefore take that risk because you've got a portfolio of 20, and even 3 work out, the actual returns will be much higher. For investors who are trying to invest in one stock here, I think that will be probably a dangerous strategy. So I think it may be worthwhile to sort of invest in funds if they come up, which are investing in that, which have a more of a portfolio approach. So I think risk from individual investors will be very high, and they have to be very cognizant of that.
So, before we open out the session for a couple of questions, I just had two rapid-fire questions which I wanted you to answer. So, I'll start with Mr. Bhatt. If there was an asset class which you would avoid in 2015-16, okay, which would it be? Debt, equity, gold, or real estate?
Gold.
You would avoid gold.
Gold.
And what about you?
Absolutely.
So I think...
But highlight, avoid.
Yeah, avoid. I mean, so I think, the very clear message is other asset classes, okay, but gold, no. The second question I want to ask you is, if you had to sort of put a number to equity returns in 2015-16, what would you put it at? Less than 10%, between 10 and 20%, 20 to 30%, more than 30%?
I don't think more than 30%, but I think 10 to 20%, maybe slightly higher. So that's where, I would hang my
10 to 20%, that's your first answer.
I agree with Prabhat. Should be between 10 to 20%.
That's the consensus.
10 to 20%.
Yes.
So I think the panel seems to quite agree on the fact that we should be able to get 20%. I'll take the higher end of the sort of band and say 20% returns on equity in 2015-16. I think we can open out the session for, say, possibly two questions or so before we wind up. Is there anybody who needed to ask? And you should, tell us who you're asking, who you want to answer that question.
So on silver, there is this article which came today morning. Yes. JP Morgan has accumulated 55 million ounces of silver, and they have taken 8 million ounces silver delivery in last few days. I don't know the veracity of the article, but if people are accumulating silver, at least compared to gold, it looks like a better bet. But you need to have better storage capabilities because, the amount of silver you can buy vis-a-vis gold, your houses needs to be bigger and stronger.
Nilesh ji.
The other thing is that if you go to any jewelry shop today, they say buy gold and we'll give you silver free.
नीलेश जी मैं आपसे एक सवाल पूछना चाहता हूँ, हिंदी में पूछ चलेगा ना? नीलेश जी मैं IFA हूँ, 2002 में मैंने ARN लिया था, तब ARN नया ही आया था एकदम। मैंने 2 मंदियाँ देखी, 2003 का जो IT बबल बर्स्ट हुआ था, 2008 में जो अपना लेमैन क्राइसिस हुआ था। मैंने जो समझा वो ये कि साधारण मेरे पास जो इन्वेस्टर्स आए और जो मेरे पास वॉल्यूम हुआ वो 2003 में जब एकदम टॉप पे था मार्केट, और 2007 में जनवरी से मान लीजिए जनवरी 2008 तक बिजनेस मेरा बहुत ज़्यादा हुआ और लोगों ने पैसे दबा के डाले। उसके बाद जब मंदी आई तो जो रिटेल इन्वेस्टर्स,
I request you to come to the question.
Yeah, what I want to know.
Just ask the question. Just ask the question.
Yes. What I want to know is, सर आप ये कह रहे हो 78 लाख SIPs हैं और बहुत बड़ी आप कह रहे हैं बहुत बड़ी SIP बुक है, तो 78 लाख SIP है जब केवल 4800 IFA एक्टिव हैं, और अगर यही 4800 या 5000 IFA एक्टिव हैं, अगर आप IFAs या म्यूचुअल फंड इंडस्ट्री पे कंसंट्रेट करें, वहाँ पे आप ज़्यादा ध्यान दें, तो यही 78,000 SIP शायद 8,000 करोड़ SIP हो सकते हैं। यू कैन थिंक ओवर इट कि जो आप सोच रहे हैं 1 लाख करोड़ या 1.5 लाख करोड़ रुपए PF से आ सकते हैं, आज आप देखिए FD बुक आप इंडिया में देखें 70% ऑफ द इन्वेस्टमेंट्स गोज टू FD।
I think your question is why don't you just get more SIPs, right?
No.
Then what's your question?
I want to say that why don't you concentrate on promoting mutual fund?
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
मतलब मेरा तो काम ही ये है।
He's got a vested interest, so you shouldn't be asking him this question.
मैं तो अपनी दूसरी नौकरी छोड़ के म्यूचुअल फंड में काम करने के लिए 3 महीने पहले ही आया। So, मैंने तो अपनी करियर इसके ऊपर ही लगा दी है, नहीं तो मैं प्रभात भाई के पास जाता, उनके पास से पैसे लेता, अपना वेंचर चालू करता। सो म्यूचुअल फंड अपने आप बनेंगे, ये वर्ड ऑफ माउथ पब्लिसिटी है। 1993 में मतलब मैं जब म्यूचुअल फंड बेचने जाता था, लोगों ने भगा दिया था घर में से, अब लोग बिठा के चाय पिलाते हैं, तो यहाँ तक तो पहुँच गए हैं। अब कुछ ही साल में ऐसा समय आएगा कि लोग अपने को सामने से पैसा देंगे, खाना भी खिलाएंगे। Yes.
So the question is, I'll come and relax. Hello? Yeah. Okay. A question is, is the bottom there in terms of, let's say somebody wants to do lump sum in the current situation? Would it be there, or staggered approach is more advisable?
So there's no way one can predict short-term trend of the market.
Correct.
I mean, clearly in Jan 2008, we had no idea that 8,000 will be the bottom.
Absolutely.
Genuinely, we thought 12, 13,000, the bottom has been made. But after that, stock corrected significantly. So lump sum investment is only for Rip Van Winkle. You invest today, and then after 10 years you wake up, then yes, it's a great time to do such kind of a lump sum investment. But unfortunately, all of us have the ability to look at the NAVs on a daily basis, prices on a daily basis. So lump sum, not advisable at all. As you are mentioned, do an SIP kind of thing. And within SIP, one can do, kind of super or smart SIP. So you run one SIP which is invested irrespective of the market movement, and some amount which is always invested at the bottom of the market. When you are playing momentum, you invest today, tomorrow there is a return. You invest tomorrow, day after tomorrow there is bigger return. You put all the money, and day after tomorrow, market's correct. So there is a short-term gain, but long-term pain. In a reverse market, which is a value market, you buy today, Murphy's Law apply, 10% down. You buy tomorrow, Murphy's Law apply, 20% down. You put all lump sum money, 9/11 happens, everything goes down. But that short-term pain is again for long-term gain. So my advice will be do SIP and try to do smart SIP if you can manage it. That will increase your overall SIP return by probably 0.5% to 1%. But that 1% over 10-15 years is a good number.
One more question, sir. What's your view on the
psychology
sector?
of that whole thing is that if you put in money at so many NAVs, you don't even know what NAV you've gotten at. So you don't get worried.
So what's your view on the logistics sector? On the logistics sector?
He wants to know, do you have a view on the logistics sector? And if you don't have a view, you're welcome to say you don't have a view.
I mean, we don't cover it,
Yeah,
but
fair
I
enough.
think there is, we cover one or two companies. It is obviously growing much faster because of the fact that, now you have to be stock specific, but the fact is that e-commerce, for example, has become, a big driver of growth for certain set of companies. And there are certain set of companies like railways, for example. Railways reforms will lead to growth in some other set of companies. And then you have DFC play on that within logistics. So there will be, the overall growth is picking up in the economy. Once that happens, everybody benefits. But there will be different dynamics for different sort of logistics companies. And you have to basically take your own call on that.
Thanks, Prabhat. Thanks, Nilesh. Thanks, Mr. Bhatt. I think that was a very interesting session. I'm sure a lot of us would have taken back, some good ideas as to where we need to put our money and where we don't need to put our money. Thank you so much.
Hello, may I request Mr. Asit C. Mehta to please hand over the mementos to our speakers. Mr. Shashi Krishnan. I request all of you, please give your feedback forms before you leave. Mr. Nilesh Shah, Mr. Prabhat Avasthi, and Mr. UR Bhatt. Please give your feedback forms. We will appreciate your feedbacks.
Hello, kindly submit the feedback forms at the registration counter.